One stolen bite can change the very color of a soul. Is a magical glow enough to blind hatred? And can love survive when the light fades, leaving only the raw truth in the cold shadows? This story begins now. The 8th year at Hogwarts was supposed to be a sanctuary of logic, a quiet stretch of time for Hermione Granger to finally exist, without the weight of a prophecy or the shadow of a dark lord. The library, with its familiar scent of aged cellulose, drying ink, and the faint metallic tang of ancient protective wards, was her fortress. Outside, the Scottish rain lashed against the leaded glass panes, creating a rhythmic drumming that usually helped her focus. Tonight, however, her focus was diverted toward a small ceramic plate perched precariously on the edge of her mahogany desk. On that plate sat a cupcake. It was a masterpiece of clandestine alchemy, topped with a swirl of lavender-tinted frosting that shimmered with an unnatural, pearlescent glow. This wasn't mere baking. It was the physical vessel for her latest experimental project, a refined essence of radiance potion. She had spent weeks stabilizing the moonstone dust and crushed pearl to ensure the effect wasn't just skin deep, but an enhancement of one's natural symmetry. It was meant to be her final project for Slughorn, a testament to her mastery over the most volatile of cosmetic enchantments. Just one more reference, Hermione whispered to herself, her voice swallowed by the vast vaulted ceiling. She stood up, her fingers trailing briefly over the spine of a leather-bound volume before she turned toward the restricted section. She needed the compendium of luster to verify the half-life of the silverweed infusion. She left the cupcake behind, a silent sentinel amidst her towers of parchment. She didn't hear the soft, rhythmic click of dragon-hide boots against the stone floor. She didn't see the pale hand, adorned with a signet ring that caught the flickering candlelight, reach out with practiced arrogance. Draco Malfoy was bored. Boredom, for him, was a dangerous state of mind. It led to a specific kind of restlessness that usually resulted in him seeking out the one person in the castle who still looked at him with enough fire to make him feel alive. He had been wandering the aisles, his pale features sharpened by the shadows, looking for a way to puncture the silence. And there she was. Or rather, there her workspace was, a chaotic monument to Gryffindor overachievement. He leaned against the neighboring shelf, his grey eyes scanning her notes. Potency of reflected light, he read internally, a sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. Typical. She was trying to bottle the sun itself. His gaze dropped to the cupcake. It looked ridiculous. It looked sweet. It looked like exactly the kind of thing he wanted to take away from her, just to see the indignant spark in her hazel eyes. With a smirk that didn't quite reach his weary eyes, Draco picked up the cake. He didn't care for sweets, but the idea of Hermione returning to find her precious experiment gone was too tempting to resist. He took a bite. The flavor was an explosion of violet and honey, followed by a strange, tingling sensation that danced across his tongue like tiny sparks of electricity. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it was unnervingly delicious. By the time he heard the rustle of her robes returning, the cupcake was gone, leaving nothing but a few crumbs and a faint floral scent in the air. Hermione rounded the corner, the heavy book clutched to her chest. She stopped dead. Her eyes flew to the empty plate, then up to the tall, slender figure, wiping a trace of lavender frosting from his thumb, with agonizing slowness. "Malfoy," she breathed, her voice a mix of disbelief and rising fury. "Tell me you didn't." Draco swallowed, feeling a sudden, intense warmth radiating from his chest outward to his fingertips. It was as if he'd swallowed a miniature star. He forced a nonchalant shrug, though his heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was sitting there, Grieger, practically begging to be put out of its misery. A bit heavy on the sugar, if I'm honest. That wasn't a snack. Hermione dropped the book onto the table with a dull thud that echoed through the stacks. She stepped into his personal space, her face flushed with a cocktail of anger and genuine alarm. "That was a highly concentrated, experimental aesthetic catalyst. I spent 3 weeks stabilizing the pearl dust suspension." Draco opened his mouth to deliver a scathing retort about her hobbies, but the words died in his throat. A strange sensation washed over him, a shimmering, liquid feeling, as if his very bones were being realigned by a gentle, invisible hand. The air around him seemed to thicken, vibrating with a low melodic hum that only he could hear. What did you put in that thing?" Draco asked, his voice dropping an octave, sounding richer, like velvet sliding over stone. Hermione's anger faltered. She squinted at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. The candlelight was playing tricks on her. Draco Malfoy had always been handsome in a sharp, cold, predatory sort of way, all angles and pale shadows. But as she watched, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften and refine simultaneously. His skin, usually the color of parchment, began to emit a soft, ethereal luminescence, as if he were being lit from within by a hidden moon. "Malfoy?" she whispered, her fingers nervously twisting the cuff of her sleeve. He moved to step away, but his coordination felt different, more fluid, more intentional. As he passed a dark, glass-fronted cabinet, he caught a glimpse of his reflection. He froze. The man in the glass was him, yet not him. His hair, usually slicked back or artfully dishevelled, now fell in perfect silken strands that seemed to catch every stray photon in the room. His eyes weren't just grey, they were vast, stormy oceans flecked with literal silver. Every feature had been heightened to a level of impossible, heartbreaking symmetry. He looked less like a wizard and more like a celestial being who had accidentally wandered into a dusty library. "Oh no," Hermione groaned, burying her face in her hands. "The dosage. I calculated it for a gradual ingestion over 12 hours, not a single bite absorption." Draco didn't hear her. He was staring at his hands. They were glowing, not brightly, but with a subtle, pulsating gold light that traced the veins beneath his skin. He felt an overwhelming sense of presence. He felt visible. For a man who had spent the last year trying to shrink into the shadows of his own reputation, this was a nightmare wrapped in a golden shroud. "Fix it," he snapped, but the command came out sounding like a seductive plea. He winced at the sound of his own voice. "Grey Grange, Hermione, fix this. I can't go back to the common room looking like a luminous peacock." Hermione looked up, and for the first time she felt the magnetic pull she had written about in her notes. It was visceral. Her breath hitched in her throat. Even knowing it was the result of a potion, even knowing it was Malfoy, her brain struggled to reconcile the logic with the sheer, overwhelming beauty standing before her. The atmosphere in the library had shifted. The air felt charged, heavy with the scent of ozone and the sweetness of the lavender frosting still lingering on his breath. "I can't just fix it, Draco," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It has to work its way through your system. It's integrated with your magical core now." The silence that followed was thick, vibrating with the static of the potion's energy. Draco stepped closer, his new radiant aura casting her shadow long against the bookshelves. The hostility between them was still there, but it was being warped by a new, terrifying tension. "How long?" he demanded, his silver eyes searching hers with a desperation that made her chest ache. "I don't know," she admitted, her gaze dropping to his lips before she could stop herself. "A week? Maybe 2? Draco let out a jagged breath, and a small puff of golden mist escaped his lips. He looked at the empty plate, then back at the girl who had accidentally turned him into a living masterpiece. The seesaw of their relationship had just been pushed off a cliff. "Then I suppose," Draco murmured, his voice sending a traitorous shiver down her spine. "You're going to be very busy in the coming days, aren't you, Granger?" He turned and walked away, his every movement a choreographed dance of light. Hermione stayed in the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs, staring at the crumbs of her masterpiece and wondering if she had just brewed the most beautiful catastrophe of her life. The following morning, the great hall did not merely wake up, it ignited. Usually, the breakfast hour was a cacophony of clattering cutlery, the rustle of the Daily Prophet, and the sleepy drone of students dreading transfiguration. But as the heavy oak doors swung open and Draco Malfoy stepped over the threshold, the sound died a sudden, strangled death. It wasn't the silence of respect, nor the silence of fear that had followed him since the war. It was a vacuum of sheer, breathless disbelief. Draco felt it immediately. The atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to spike, pressing against his skin like a physical weight. He kept his gaze fixed on the Slytherin table, his jaws set in a line of rigid marble, but he could feel the collective intake of breath from 300 lungs. He wasn't just walking, he was gliding. The essence of radiance had settled into his marrow, and with every step, his robes seemed to catch a light that didn't exist, rippling with the luster of crushed silk. Hermione, seated at the Gryffindor table with her nose buried in advanced potion-making, felt the shift in the air before she saw him. The hair on her arms stood up. There was a low, magnetic hum vibrating in the floorboards. When she finally looked up, her spoon slipped from her hand, splashing into her porridge with a wet thud. He was devastating. The morning sun, streaming through the high windows, seemed to converge on him, turning his hair into a halo of spun platinum. His skin possessed a translucent porcelain quality that made him look less like a student and more like a statue brought to life by a desperate sculptor. But it was his eyes, mercurial, deep and rimmed with a silver fire, that made Hermione's heart perform a jarring, frantic skip. "Bloody hell," Ron whispered beside her, his mouth hanging open. Did Malfoy? Did he have a run-in with a Vila, or a vat of industrial-strength polish? "It's an accident," Hermione hissed, her face flushing a deep, humiliated crimson. She grabbed her bag, the leather strap biting into her shoulder as she stood up. She couldn't stay here. The sight of him was doing something to her biology that her logic couldn't veto. Her pulse was a frantic tremor in her throat. As she tried to make a quick exit, Draco intercepted her. It wasn't a collision, but a visceral alignment of paths. He stepped into her orbit, and the scent hit her. Not the usual cold mint and expensive cedar, but something warmer, like sun-drenched stone and wild thyme. It was the scent of the potion, amplified by his own heat. "Granger," he said. His voice was no longer a drawl. It was a resonance that vibrated in the very marrow of her bones. "Don't," she snapped, though it lacked its usual bite. She kept her eyes fixed on the second button of his shirt, terrified that if she looked up, she would drown in that silver gaze. "I'm working on the neutralizer. Just stay away from me until it's ready." "Stay away?" Draco leaned in, his shadow falling over her, smelling of honey and trouble. "I can't walk down a corridor without a flock of Hufflepuffs fainting in my wake. I've had 3 portraits offer to recite sonnets to me. You did this, Hermione. You're the only one who can see past this ridiculous glow." He reached out, his fingers hovering near her arm. He didn't touch her, but the proximity created a tactile friction in the air, a static charge that made the fine hairs on her neck rise. Hermione felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her already perfect sleeve cuffs, her fingers trembling. "I'm not the only one who sees it, Malfoy. The whole school sees it. You're literally a beacon," she whispered, finally meeting his eyes. The impact was like a physical blow. The grey depths were swirling with a mixture of arrogance and a deep, hidden vulnerability that the potion couldn't mask. For a second, the "can't stand it" and "can't help but think" clashed violently in her mind. "I don't care about the school," he said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper that only she could hear over the rising murmur of the hall. "They're staring at the light. You're the only one looking at the shadow." He pulled back then, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his own bag. The warmth he had projected was replaced by a sudden, sharp coldness. "Fix it by tonight. I'll be in the North Tower at 8. Don't be late, or I might just start charging for autographs." He swept past her, leaving a trail of shimmering air in his wake. Hermione stood frozen, her fingers clutching the strap of her bag so hard her nails left crescents in the leather. She was angry, furious that he had stolen her project, furious that he was using his beauty as a weapon. But beneath the anger was a terrifying magnetic pull. She felt like a compass needle being forced toward a north she didn't want to find. The day was a blur of distractions. In charms, Flitwick nearly fell off his stack of books when Draco entered the room. In the corridors, the usual jostling subsided into a respectful, almost worshipful path-clearing whenever the golden boy of Slytherin appeared. Draco played the part with a cold, haughty mask, but Hermione saw the way his jaw tightened every time someone gasped. He hated it. The boy who had spent years demanding attention was now being suffocated by it. By the time 8 o'clock rolled around, the castle was cloaked in a heavy, damp mist. Hermione climbed the winding stairs of the North Tower, her footsteps echoing in the hollow stone corridor. She carried a small vial of dark, murky liquid, the first attempt at an inversion. The room at the top was an abandoned divination classroom, smelling of stale incense and old dust. Draco was already there, standing by a tall, arched window. The moonlight hit him, and for a moment, Hermione couldn't breathe. He looked like an illustration from a tragic fairy tale. The potion's effect seemed to intensify in the dark, his skin casting a soft, lunar glow that illuminated the dust motes dancing around him. "You came," he said, turning toward her. "I said I would," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She set her bag on a dusty table. "This is a concentrated solution of wormwood and powdered root of asphodel. It should, in theory, dampen the external radiance by neutralizing the pearl dust suspension." She approached him, the vial held out like a shield. As she drew closer, the atmospheric pressure between them shifted again. It was the approach stage of a dance she didn't know the steps to. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the frantic thudding of her own heart. "Drink it," she commanded. Draco took the vial, his silver ring biting into his skin as he gripped the glass. His eyes never left hers. He drank it in one gulp, his throat working as he swallowed the bitter mixture. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a sharp, hissing sound filled the air, like water hitting a hot coal. A cloud of thick, grey smoke erupted from Draco's skin, smelling of sulphur and wet earth. "Malfoy!" Hermione cried out, reaching through the smoke to grab his shoulders. The smoke cleared as quickly as it had appeared. Draco was still standing, but the glow hadn't vanished. It had merely changed. Instead of a soft golden light, he now emitted a sharp, flickering silver radiance, like lightning trapped under his skin. It was jagged and volatile. "It didn't work," he rasped, his hands flying to her waist to steady himself. The touch was electric. Through the layers of her robes, Hermione felt the heat of his palms, the pressure of his fingers. The repulsion she usually felt for him was being incinerated by a sudden, overwhelming warmth. She looked up at him, her breath hitching. His face was inches from hers, the silver light in his eyes reflecting the confusion and the raw, unadulterated tension that had been building between them for years. "It made it worse," she whispered, her hands still resting on his chest. She could feel his heart racing, a frantic human beat beneath the magical shimmer. Draco's grip tightened on her waist. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped. The arrogant Malfoy vanished, leaving behind a boy who was terrified of his own reflection. "Granger," he murmured, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. "What are you doing to me?" The air in the tower was thick with the scent of the failed potion and the underlying magnetic pull of two souls finally colliding in the dark. The warmth was undeniable, a flickering flame in the cold stone room. But then Draco stiffened. He pushed her away, his face contorting into a sneer of self-loathing. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "You're incompetent. You're not fixing me. You're turning me into a freak show." The cold hit Hermione like a physical slap. The trust she had momentarily felt, the shared vulnerability, shattered. She grabbed her bag, her eyes stinging with frustrated tears. "Fine," she spat, her voice trembling. "Enjoy your pedestal, Malfoy. I hope the view is worth the loneliness." She turned and fled down the stairs, the hollow echo of her footsteps the only sound in the vacant corridor. Behind her, in the North Tower, Draco stood in the silver light, his knuckles white as he gripped the stone windowsill, the static of the potions screaming in his blood. The aftermath of the North Tower disaster left a bitter, metallic taste in the back of Hermione's throat that no amount of pumpkin juice could wash away. For 3 days, she avoided the Great Hall, sequestering herself in the humid, earth-scented safety of Greenhouse 3, or the stifling silence of the girls' dormitory. She told herself it was to focus on a more stable counter-agent, but every time she closed her eyes, she felt the phantom pressure of Draco's hands on her waist, and the terrifying silver hum of his magic singing to her own. The cold he had cast between them was a physical barrier, as sharp as a winter's frost on the Black Lake. He had called her incompetent. He had retreated into the jagged armor of his surname. And Hermione, fueled by a mixture of wounded pride and genuine hurt, had let the bridge burn. But the magnetic pull of the potion was not so easily dismissed. It was a tether, invisible and unrelenting, that tightened every time they were in the same wing of the castle. On Thursday, the atmospheric pressure became unbearable. Hermione was in the library, hunched over a bubbling miniature cauldron she had smuggled into a hidden nook behind the History of Magic section. The scent of dried valerian and crushed beetles hung heavy in the air. She was trying to strip away the radiance layer by layer, but the potion was proving to be sentient, wrapping itself around Draco's essence like a golden vine. A shadow fell over her parchment, long and elegant. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The air grew charged, the static electricity making the fine hairs on her neck dance. "I thought I told you to stay away, Granger," Draco said. His voice was a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate the very glass vials on her table. Hermione's knuckles whitened as she gripped her stirring rod. "This is a public library, Malfoy, and if I recall, you were the one who followed me into this corner." She finally looked up, and the breath left her lungs in a sharp, involuntary hiss. The silver lightning that had plagued him in the tower had settled into something even more distracting. He wasn't just glowing now, he was refracting light. Every time he moved, a spectrum of colours danced across the stone walls, as if he were a human prism. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also wrong. It was a mask that screamed of artificiality. Draco didn't look triumphant. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his shimmering eyes, and his movements were jerky, lacking his usual predatory grace. He slumped into the chair opposite her, the wood creaking under his weight. "The Hufflepuffs are starting a cult," he muttered, his head dropping into his hands. His fingers, still glowing with that soft lunar light, tangled in his silver blonde hair. "I can't sit in the library without someone trying to touch my sleeve for good luck. I feel like a cursed relic in a museum." The warmth returned to Hermione's chest, unbidden and traitorous. She saw the tremor in his hands. This wasn't the arrogant Prince of Slytherin. This was a boy being consumed by a beauty he hadn't earned and didn't want. "It's the essence of radiance, reacting to your internal stress," she said softly, her voice losing its defensive edge. "The potion was designed to enhance harmony. Because you're conflicted, the magic is fracturing. It's trying to compensate for the chaos inside you by projecting more light." Draco looked up, his silver eyes searching hers. For a moment, the "can't stand it" was replaced by a desperate, silent plea. "Then stop the chaos, Hermione. I can't live like this. Every time someone looks at me, I wonder if they're seeing the man who stood on the astronomy tower, or if they're just blinded by your bloody cupcake." The mention of his guilt, the unspoken rot he carried, made the air between them thicken with a new kind of tension. It wasn't just the potion now. It was the weight of their shared history, the friction of their opposing sides. "I'm trying," she whispered, her fingers hovering over the table, inches from his. "But you have to let me in, Draco. I can't stabilize the magic if you keep pushing me away with every breath." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the rhythmic bubbling of the cauldron and the distant, muffled sounds of the castle. Draco's gaze dropped to her hand. Slowly, with agonizing hesitation, he turned his palm upward. It was a silent invitation, an approach. Hermione reached out, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When her skin finally met his, the interference was visceral. A shock of pure, unfiltered energy surged up her arm, making her gasp. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming. A flood of his emotions, his fear, his isolation, and a surprising, sharp spark of admiration for the girl who refused to give up on him. "Your pulse," he murmured, his thumb brushing against the sensitive skin of her wrist. "It's racing." "So is yours," she countered, her voice barely a breath. The tactile friction between them was magnetic. She felt herself leaning in, drawn by the atmospheric pressure that seemed to fold the world around them until there was only this small, flickering circle of light. The trust was beginning to knit itself back together, fragile as a spider's silk. "I don't hate you, you know," Draco said, his voice a jagged rasp in the quiet. "I hated that you were better than me. I hated that you looked at me and saw exactly what I was. But this light, it's the first time I've felt like I could be something else, even if it is a lie." "It's not all a lie, Draco," Hermione said, her fingers tightening around his. "The potion only enhances what is already there. The symmetry, the light, it's yours. I just gave it a voice." The look he gave her then was so raw, so stripped of his usual malice, that Hermione felt her defenses crumble entirely. The warmth was no longer a flicker. It was a steady, burning heat. But then the library doors creaked open. The sound of giggling girls and the heavy footsteps of a prefect broke the spell. Draco's expression instantly shuttered. He pulled his hand away as if burned, the silver light around him sharpening into a defensive, icy glare. "Don't get sentimental, Granger," he snapped, the cold returning with a vengeance. "It's just a chemical reaction. Fix the potion, or I'll find someone who can." He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the stone floor. Without another word, he vanished into the stacks, leaving Hermione sitting in the darkness, her hands still tingling from his touch. The betrayal of the moment stung worse than his previous insults. He had opened a door just to slam it in her face. Hermione stared at her bubbling cauldron, the purple steam rising like a mockery of her efforts. She realized then that the conflict wasn't just in the potion. It was in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking, with a hunger that had nothing to do with cupcakes and everything to do with a man drowning in a sea of his own making. She didn't stay to finish the brew. She packed her things with trembling fingers, her mind a whirlwind of internal monologues and doubts. Was she falling for the man, or the magic? Was he seeking help, or just a way to keep her close enough to hurt? As she walked back to Gryffindor Tower, the Scottish rain began to beat against the castle walls once more. The sound was hollow and lonely, echoing the state of her own heart. The seesaw of their relationship was no longer a simple game of back and forth. It had become a high-stakes struggle for the very souls they had tried so hard to protect. The cold was deep, but as she reached the portrait of the fat lady, Hermione looked down at her hand. A faint silver shimmer still clung to her skin, a residual glow from his touch. It was a reminder that no matter how hard he pushed, the magnetic pull was only getting stronger. She wouldn't stop, not because of the potion and not because of Slughorn's grade. She would fix this because she needed to see Draco Malfoy in the dark, without the light, and know if the warmth she felt was real or just another beautiful illusion. The tension was reaching its peak, and Hermione knew that the next time they met, something would have to break, either the potion or the fragile, unspoken bond they were weaving in the shadows of the castle. The following week, the atmosphere of Hogwarts felt stretched to a breaking point, like a violin string wound a fraction too tight. The essence of radiance had entered its most volatile phase, the resonance. Draco no longer just glowed, he hummed. A low, choral vibration followed him, a sound so pure it made the younger students weep without knowing why. For Draco, it was an invasive, mocking soundtrack to his own internal discord. Every time he felt a surge of bitterness or the familiar, gnawing bite of shame, the light around him would fracture into brilliant, jagged shards of violet and silver, reflecting the chaos of his mind for all to see. Hermione was drowning in research. Her dormitory bed was buried under parchment scrolls and ancient grimoires on spiritual reflection and the alchemy of the soul. She had realized, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that the potion hadn't just changed Draco's appearance. It had anchored itself to his emotional state. To strip away the beauty, she had to understand the man. And that was a territory more dangerous than any forbidden forest. "He's skipping meals again," Ginny remarked one morning, watching the Slytherin table where Draco's seat remained conspicuously empty, though a faint, lingering shimmer hung in the air where he usually sat. "People are calling him the Angel of the Dungeons, Hermione. It's getting weird. Pansy Parkinson looks like she's ready to start a shrine." Hermione didn't answer. She was watching the way the candlelight caught a stray silver hair on her own robes, a gift from their last collision in the library. She felt a sudden, frantic need to find him, not as a researcher, but as the only person who knew that the angel was currently rotting with self-doubt. She found him in the one place no one would look for beauty, the room of requirement. When she stepped through the door, the room had manifested as a vast, echoing hall of mirrors. It was cold, the air tasting of frost and old stone. Draco was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by hundreds of reflections of his own impossible perfection. He was shirtless, his pale back turned to her, and Hermione's breath hitched in her throat. The potion had traced the scars on his skin, the fading remnants of the Sectum Sempra gashes, and the dark, blurred smudge of the mark on his arm, and filled them with a soft, pulsing luminescence. It made his trauma look like art. "Get out, Granger," he said without turning. His voice was a ragged, hollow echo. "I can't," she replied, her voice steady despite the visceral alignment of her heart with the frantic rhythm of his own. "The potion is peaking, Draco. If we don't ground the energy tonight, it might become permanent. Your magical core won't be able to sustain the output." He turned then, and the sight was enough to make her knees weak. His face was a masterpiece of agony. The silver light in his eyes was so bright it was almost blinding, leaking out from his lashes like luminous tears. "Permanent?" he laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that cracked the silence of the room. "Isn't that what you wanted? To create something so beautiful the world couldn't look away? Well, look at me. I'm a god made of sugar and moonstone, and I can't even stand the sight of my own hands." He lashed out, his fist striking one of the mirrors. The glass shattered, but instead of shards falling to the floor, they dissolved into sparks of golden dust. The static in the room intensified, making Hermione's hair stand on end. "Stop it!" she cried, stepping into his space. The magnetic pull was overwhelming now, drawing her toward him like a moth to a funeral pyre. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she grabbed his wrists. "Draco, look at me. Not the mirrors. Look at me." The touch was a jarring impact. It wasn't the soft warmth of the library. It was a bolt of raw, unadulterated power. Hermione felt her own magic rush out to meet his, a desperate attempt to stabilize the storm. The atmospheric pressure dropped, the air becoming thin and cold. Draco froze, his chest heaving. His knuckles were white where she gripped them, the silver ring on his finger biting into his skin. For a long, breathless moment, they stood in the center of the shimmering wreckage, their breaths mingling in the frigid air. "Why do you care?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm the villain in your story, Hermione. I'm the one who sat back while you were tortured on my drawing room floor. Why are you trying to save my face?" "Because it was never about your face," she shouted, her eyes stinging with sudden hot tears. "I didn't make the potion to make you beautiful, Draco. I made it to show the world that there was light left in you. I didn't realize how much it would hurt to see you struggle with it." The warmth that followed was a slow, creeping tide. Draco's grip on her wrists softened, his fingers sliding down to lace through hers. The silver light around him began to pulse in time with her heartbeat. The trust was there, a fragile, thrumming thing between their palms. "I can't be what you want me to be," he murmured, stepping closer until their robes brushed. "Even with this magic, I'm still just me." "I know," she breathed, her gaze fixed on his mouth. The "can't help but think" was winning. "I don't want the potion, Draco. I want the man who's tired of hiding." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of ozone and honey was dizzying. Hermione felt the tremor in his body, the vulnerability he usually masked with a sneer now laid bare in the silver glow. This was the approach, the moment where the friction turned into something deeper, something magnetic. But just as his lips grazed the corner of her mouth, a ghost of a touch that sent a jolt of pure fire through her veins, the room groaned. One of the remaining mirrors erupted in a flash of violet light, a warning that the energy was becoming unstable. Draco flinched, pulling back. The cold returned instantly, his eyes shuttering as he realized how close he had come to letting go. He dropped her hands, his expression hardening into a mask of restrained guilt. "The potion is making you say that," he spat, the words a betrayal of the moment they had just shared. "You're just reacting to the essence, Granger. It's designed to elicit attraction. You're not seeing me. You're seeing your own handiwork." "That's not true," she protested, her voice falling into a desperate whisper. I know the difference between a charm and a feeling, Draco. Do you? He backed away, his silhouette refracting 1,000 different colors against the mirrored walls. Because I don't. I don't know where the cupcake ends and I begin anymore, and neither do you. He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing like hollow drum beats in the vacant corridor. The room of mirrors began to dissolve, the glass turning into mist, leaving Hermione standing in a dark, empty classroom. The betrayal was sharp, a jagged edge that cut through her resolve. He had used her own logic against her, turning her experiment into a weapon to keep her at a distance. She stood in the dark, her hands still vibrating with the ghost of his touch, wondering if the surprising thing about the cupcake wasn't the beauty it gave him, but the way it had stripped away her own defenses. The internal conflict was no longer about the potion. It was about the terrifying realization that she was falling for a man who believed he was only lovable when he was enchanted. Hermione wiped a tear from her cheek, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her wand. She wouldn't let him hide behind the light. If the potion wanted to show the essence of radiance, then she would force it to show the truth, even if the truth broke them both. The slow burn had reached a fever pitch, and as the clock in the Gryffindor common room chimed midnight, Hermione sat down at her desk, the quills scratching frantically against the parchment. She had one more idea, a final, desperate brew. But it would require Draco to do the one thing he feared most, to stand in the dark and be seen. The atmosphere in the castle was shifting. The rain had turned to a light, ethereal snow, coating the towers in a layer of white that rivaled Draco's glow. The stage was set for the final shift, the moment where the cold would either freeze them apart forever or melt into a heat they could no longer deny. The 8th year dormitories were silent, save for the rhythmic scratching of Hermione's quill and the distant, muffled groan of the castle's ancient stones settling into the frost. The air in her small study nook felt charged, thick with the scent of dried aconite and the sharp, metallic tang of the silverweed she had been obsessively distilling. She was no longer just a student. She was an architect of a breaking point. The essence of radiance had become a parasite, feeding on Draco's volatility, and she knew that if she didn't provide an exit, the magic would eventually collapse inward, taking his magical core with it. Her internal monologue was a frantic loop of logic and terror. She told herself this was about the integrity of her potion, about the safety of a fellow student. But the can't help but think was louder now, a pulse in her temples that throbbed with the memory of his skin against hers. She was haunted by the way the silver light had pooled in the hollow of his throat, and the jagged, desperate look in his eyes when he told her he didn't know where the cupcake ended, and he began. She needed a catalyst, not for the potion, but for him. The approach happened on a Tuesday, under a sky so grey it seemed the sun had forgotten the Highlands. Hermione found Draco in the owlery. It was a place of cold draughts and the soft, dry rustle of feathers. He was standing by the open stone window, his breath hitching in a series of silver puffs that vanished into the wind. He didn't have a letter. He was simply staring out at the forbidden forest, his silhouette a shimmering, tragic, sharp line against the gloom. "The atmospheric pressure is dropping," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. A storm is coming, Draco, and not just a weather-related one. He didn't turn. His knuckles were white as he gripped the stone ledge, his signet ring biting into his finger. The glow around him was dim today, flickering like a dying candle, reacting to the profound cold of his mood. Let it come, Granger. Maybe the lightning will finally burn this ridiculous shine off me. I have the final stage of the neutralizer, she said, stepping closer. The tactile friction in the air was magnetic, drawing her toward the circle of his fading light. But it won't work like the others. It's not a liquid you drink. It's a sensory displacement. It requires synchronization. Draco finally turned, his silver eyes narrowing. The repulsion was there, but it was thin, a transparent veil over a deep, aching vulnerability. Synchronization? You mean you want to link your magic to mine again, to play with the freak show one last time? I want to save you from yourself, she snapped, her sudden, frantic need to make him understand, causing her to step into his personal space. Her fingers brushed the wool of his sleeve, and a spark of static electricity jumped between them, a visceral alignment that made her heart perform a frantic skip. Stop acting like you're the only one who's suffering here. Every time you push me away, you're just proving that you're terrified of being something other than a disappointment. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hoot of a distant owl. Draco's jaw tightened, the muscles working in his neck. The warmth surged back into his gaze, a flickering flame of anger that quickly melted into something much more dangerous. "You think you know me," he whispered, stepping so close she could smell the ozone and the faint, lingering sweetness of the lavender. "You think, because you baked a cursed cake and saw me glow, you've reached the center of the labyrinth. You haven't seen anything, Hermione." He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek. He didn't touch her, but the heat from his skin was a physical pressure, a magnetic pull that made her want to lean into the void. The tension between them was no longer a seesaw. It was a taut wire, vibrating at a frequency that threatened to shatter the stone walls around them. "Then show me," she challenged, her voice trembling. "Let me in. Stop using the light as a shield." The trust hung in the air, a fragile, shimmering thread. Draco's fingers finally made contact, grazing her jawline. The impact was electric, a jarring friction that sent a tremor through her entire body. He looked at her with a raw, unadulterated intensity that made her feel more seen than any potion ever could. "If I let go," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "There's no going back to being enemies, Granger. You realize that? I won't be able to look at you without remembering how you looked at me when I was a monster made of light." "We were never just enemies," she whispered back, her gaze fixed on his silver eyes. But then, the betrayal of his own fear took hold. Draco stiffened, his hand dropping as if her skin had burned him. The silver light around him flared into a sharp, defensive violet. "Get the neutralizer ready for tonight," he said, his voice returning to its cold, restrained drawl. "In the astronomy tower, after curfew. If this doesn't work, I'm going to the infirmary, and I'll tell Madame Pomfrey exactly whose experiment ruined my life." He swept past her, the wind from his robes chilling the air. Hermione stayed by the window, her hand moving to her cheek where his warmth still lingered. The cold was bitter, but she saw the tremor in his shoulders as he walked away. He wasn't retreating, he was fleeing. She spent the rest of the day in a trance. The internal conflict was reaching a fever pitch. She knew the sensory displacement was a risk. It required them to be in total physical and magical alignment, a literal sharing of senses to ground the excess energy. It was a slow burn that was about to ignite. As night fell, a heavy, freezing rain began to lash the castle. Hermione climbed the stairs to the astronomy tower, her boots echoing in the hollow stone corridor. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient magic. When she reached the top, she found Draco standing in the center of the platform. He had stripped off his robes, wearing only a thin white shirt that was already damp from the spray of the rain. The essence of radiance was at its peak. He looked like a star that had fallen to earth and was struggling to stay alive. The light was pulsing in jagged waves, illuminating the falling rain like diamonds. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Yes," Hermione replied, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took out a small crystal bowl filled with a clear, shimmering liquid, the conductor. "We have to hold the bowl between us. We have to breathe together. You have to let the magic flow out of you and into me, and then I will ground it into the stone." She stepped toward him, the atmospheric pressure between them so high it felt like walking through water. As she took her place opposite him, the magnetic pull was visceral. She could feel the static in his hair, the heat of his skin, the frantic beat of his heart. They reached out simultaneously, their fingers meeting around the cold rim of the crystal bowl. The collision was an explosion of sensation. Hermione gasped as Draco's magic flooded her, a cold silver tide of guilt, longing, and a sharp, piercing beauty that had nothing to do with the potion. "Don't let go," Draco gasped, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the bowl. "I won't," she promised, her eyes locking onto his. The warmth was overwhelming now, a searing heat that defied the freezing rain. To drain from Draco's skin, more to drain from Draco's skin, a new, more terrifying tension took its place. The light was fading, but the "can't help but think" was growing into a roar. In the receding glow, Hermione saw the man, the real man, and she realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated fear that she didn't want the light to go if it meant he would disappear back into the shadows. "Draco," she whispered, her voice lost in the thunder. He didn't answer with words. He tightened his grip on the bowl, and for the first time, he didn't pull away. The trust was absolute. A bridge built of crumbs and silver light, and as the last of the radiance began to flicker, the real surprise was just beginning to unfold. The astronomy tower felt like the epicenter of a collapsing star. The silver radiance, once a soft lunar glow, had sharpened into jagged needles of light that pierced the heavy, rain-slicked darkness. Hermione's hands, gripped tightly around the crystal bowl opposite Draco's, were trembling with the sheer atmospheric pressure of the magic pouring through her. It was a visceral alignment, a conduit of raw energy that tasted of ozone and ancient stone. Every breath she took was a struggle against the magnetic pull of his magical core, which seemed to be trying to anchor itself to hers in a desperate bid for stability. "Stay with me, Draco," she gasped, her voice barely a thread against the howling wind. He didn't answer with words. His knuckles were white, the skin stretched taut over his joints as he fought to keep his grip on the bowl. The essence of radiance was draining out of him in rhythmic, pulsing waves, flowing through their joined hands like liquid mercury. But as the artificial beauty receded, it left behind a vacuum of profound cold. Draco's face, flickering between the blinding shimmer and the grey reality of the night, was a mask of agony. The internal conflict he had carried for months, the guilt of his past, the fear of his future, was being stripped bare by the very potion that had tried to hide it. It's too much, Draco rasped, his eyes snapping open. They were no longer stormy silver. They were a dull, haunted grey, reflecting the lightning that danced across the Black Lake. Hermione, let go. It'll tear you apart. I won't, she shouted, her sudden, frantic need to protect him overriding every instinct of self-preservation. She stepped closer, closing the gap between them until the crystal bowl was pressed against their chests. The tactile friction was overwhelming. She could feel the frantic, uneven thudding of his heart through the damp fabric of his shirt, a human rhythm that mocked the celestial light still clinging to his skin. The warmth that surged through her then was not magical. It was a fierce, grounding heat that defied the freezing rain. She leaned her forehead against his, their breaths mingling in a silver mist. In this breathless silence, the can't stand it finally dissolved into the can't help but think. She wasn't thinking about the potion anymore. She was thinking about the way his fingers felt against hers, cold, trembling, and utterly human. Trust me, she whispered, the words vibrating between them. Draco's eyes searched hers, searching for the betrayal he always expected, but finding only a stubborn Gryffindor resolve. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders broke. He slumped forward, his weight resting against her, and for the first time, the approach was complete. He wasn't fighting the magic or her. He was simply existing within the storm. With a sound like a single indrawn breath, the crystal began to hum, a high, crystalline note that resonated in the very marrow of their bones. Then, with a sound like a single indrawn breath, the light vanished. The tower was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the frantic drumming of rain on the stone floor. The bowl, now heavy with a dull, leaden liquid, slipped from their numb fingers and shattered against the ground. Neither of them moved. They were still standing in the center of the platform, locked in a visceral alignment that had survived the death of the enchantment. Hermione's heart was racing, a tremor in her chest that she couldn't suppress. Without the glow, she couldn't see his face, but she could feel his presence, a heavy, magnetic weight in the dark. The atmospheric pressure had shifted from magical to something much more intimate, much more terrifying. Is it gone? Draco's voice was a jagged whisper, stripped of its usual drawl and arrogance. He sounded small, hollowed out by the withdrawal of the magic. Yes, Hermione breathed, her hand moving tentatively through the dark until her fingers brushed the wet fabric of his sleeve. It's gone, Draco. You're just you again. She felt him flinch at her touch, a reflexive repulsion born of a year of hiding. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, his hand fumbling in the shadows until his cold fingers found her jawline. The tactile friction was sharper now, unmediated by the cushion of the potion. It was just skin against skin, raw and honest. "I can't see you," he murmured, his thumb grazing her lower lip. The scent of rain and damp wool was thick between them. "For the first time in weeks, I can't see anything. I'm just in the dark." "The dark isn't so bad," Hermione said, her voice trembling. "It's where the truth usually hides." She felt his breath catch. The warmth returned, a slow, creeping tide that made her feel more vulnerable than the potion ever had. He moved closer, his proximity a physical heat that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. The slow burn of their shared month of secrets and stolen glances was reaching a flashpoint. "I hated that cupcake, Granger," Draco whispered, his face so close she could feel the moisture on his skin. "I hated what it did to me, but I hated more that I liked the way you looked at me when I was wearing it." "I wasn't looking at the light, Draco," she countered, her fingers curling into the front of his shirt, anchoring herself to him. "I was looking for the person who was brave enough to admit he was tired of being a shadow. I was looking for you." The silence stretched, tense and vibrating with the weight of everything they hadn't said. The collision was inevitable now. Draco's hand slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her damp curls, pulling her upward. But as his lips were inches from hers, a distance that felt like a vast, unbridgeable chasm, he hesitated. The doubt was a sudden, sharp coldness in the air. "You're only saying that because we're alone," he rasped, his knuckles whitening against her skin. "Tomorrow the sun will come up, and I'll just be the Malfoy who failed. No glow, no beauty, just a boy with a mark on his arm and a rot in his history." "I don't care about the sun," Hermione said fiercely, her hands moving up to cup his face. "And I don't care about the history. I'm here now, in the dark, and I'm not letting go." The trust was a fragile thing, but in that moment it was the only thing holding them together. Draco let out a jagged, broken breath, and the last of his resistance shattered. He leaned down, his mouth finding hers in a jarring impact that was less a kiss and more an act of desperation. It was a collision of 2 years of suppressed friction, of "can't stand it" and "can't help but think." It tasted of rain, of salt, and of the bitter aftertaste of the potion. It was clumsy, intense, and utterly visceral. Hermione's world narrowed down to the pressure of his lips and the frantic, magnetic pull of his body against hers. He pulled back for a second, his forehead resting against hers, both of them gasping for air in the damp night. The static was still there, but it was human now, the electricity of 2 people who had finally stopped running. "Tell me this is real," Draco whispered, his voice cracking. "Tell me it's not the crumbs, Hermione." "It's real," she promised, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone. The surprise wasn't the beauty, Draco. It was us. But as she spoke, a distant light flickered at the bottom of the tower, the glow of a lantern from a patrolling filch. The cold reality of the castle was returning. Draco stiffened, the old mask of restraint threatening to slide back into place. The final shift was coming, and they both knew that the morning would bring a different kind of test. "We have to go," he said, though he didn't move his hand from her neck. "I know," she replied. They stood for one more moment in the dark, the atmospheric pressure of their shared secret heavy between them. The slow burn had finally ignited, and as they prepared to descend the stairs back into the world of titles and prejudices, They both knew that the essence of radiance had left behind something far more permanent than a glow. The internal monologue in Hermione's head was finally quiet. For the first time in her life, logic had no place here. There was only the warmth of his hand in hers as they stepped into the shadows of the corridor, leaving the shattered crystal and the silver dreams behind. The descent from the astronomy tower was a journey through a labyrinth of shadows and sudden, sharp anxieties. The cold of the castle stone seemed to seep into Hermione's bones, a stark contrast to the searing warmth that still pulsed where Draco's fingers had laced with hers. They moved in a synchronized, tactile silence, their footsteps muffled by the heavy dampness of their robes. Every time the distant flicker of a torch appeared at the end of a corridor, they would press themselves into the alcoves, the atmospheric pressure between them spiking as they held their breath. In those moments, the can't help but think became a physical weight. Hermione could feel the erratic rhythm of Draco's heart against her shoulder, a frantic human echo of the magical storm they had just survived. Draco felt a jarring friction within his own mind. The withdrawal of the essence of radiance had left him feeling raw, as if a layer of skin had been peeled away. Without the shimmering shield of the potion, he felt dangerously visible, yet entirely hollow. He kept glancing at Hermione in the periphery of his vision. In the weak, flickering light of the wall sconces, she didn't look like a hero or a researcher. She looked exhausted, her hair a wild, damp halo, her eyes wide with a vulnerability that mirrored his own. The magnetic pull was still there, tugging at the center of his chest, but it was no longer fueled by silverweed and moonstone dust. It was the terrifying, visceral alignment of two people who had seen too much of each other's shadows. "The dungeons are just ahead," Draco whispered as they reached the junction of the great staircase. His voice was a low, resonant thrum that sent a traitorous shiver down Hermione's spine. He stopped, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the strap of his bag. The repulsion of his old life, the expectations of Slytherin, the cold legacy of the Malfoys, was waiting for him just beyond the next flight of stairs. Hermione turned to him, her fingers nervously twisting the cuff of her sleeve. The silence in the corridor was thick, vibrating with the static of everything they were leaving unsaid. "Malfoy, Draco, tomorrow morning, when the sun comes up." "I know," he interrupted, his grey eyes searching hers with a desperation that made her breath hitch. The doubt was a sharp, biting frost in the air. "Tomorrow, I'm just the boy who failed his mission. No halo, no light, just the ghost in the corridors." "You're not a ghost to me," she said fiercely, stepping into his space. The tactile friction returned, a spark of pure, unfiltered heat that defied the drafty hall. She reached out, her hand hovering near his chest, wanting to feel that frantic heartbeat again. "Don't you dare go back to the shadows, Draco. Don't let them think the light was the only thing worth seeing." Draco's expression fractured. The mask of restraint he had worn for years was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of her gaze. He reached out, his thumb grazing the sensitive skin of her inner wrist, a touch so light it was almost a question. The warmth was overwhelming, a slow-burning fire that threatened to consume the last of his defenses. "You're a Gryffindor, Hermione," he murmured, his voice jagged with a sudden, sharp vulnerability. "You're built for the light. I'm..." I'm built for the cold. I don't know how to be the person you saw up there." "Then let me show you," she whispered. The approach was slow, a deliberate crossing of a chasm that had existed since their first year. Draco leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closing as he inhaled the scent of her: rain, old parchment, and a trace of the floral honey from the cupcake. It was a visceral alignment of souls, a moment where the "can't stand it" was finally irrevocably buried. But as the trust began to solidify, a sudden sharp noise echoed from the floor above, the unmistakable sound of Mrs. Norris's meow, followed by the heavy, uneven thud of Filch's boots. The betrayal of the moment was instant. Draco jerked back, his face instantly shuttering into a mask of cold, sharp angles. The magnetic pull snapped, replaced by the atmospheric pressure of the looming discovery. "Go," he hissed, his eyes darting toward the shadows of the staircase. "If they find us together, it's not just a detention, Granger. It's a scandal neither of us can afford." "I don't care about the scandal," she whispered back, her knuckles whitening as she grabbed the front of his shirt. "I do," he snapped, though the harshness was undercut by the tremor in his voice. "I won't have you dragged down into the mud with me. Not now, not after tonight." The cold hit her then, the realization that his protection was another form of distance. He was still trying to save her by pushing her away. Hermione felt a surge of frustrated tears, her chest aching with the friction of her love and his guilt. But she saw the whitening of his knuckles, the way he was shaking with the effort of holding himself back. "This isn't the end," she promised, her voice a low, fierce vow. "Just go, Hermione," he urged, his voice breaking on her name. She turned and fled into the darkness of the upper corridors, her heart hammering a frantic, hollow rhythm against her ribs. Behind her, she heard the soft, retreating click of his boots as he descended toward the dungeons. The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy shroud of what-ifs and not-yets. As she reached the safety of the Gryffindor common room, the fire was nothing but a bed of glowing embers, casting long, flickering shadows against the tapestries. Hermione sank into her favorite armchair, her hands still vibrating with the ghost of his touch. The internal monologue in her head was a whirlwind of doubts. Had she imagined the depth of his gaze? Was the warmth just a lingering side effect of the potion's resonance? She looked down at her hands and saw a single silver hair caught in the weave of her sweater. It didn't glow. It didn't hum. It was just a strand of hair, ordinary and plain. And yet, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The slow burn had moved beyond the physical world. It was now a fire in her marrow, a magnetic pull that she knew would lead her back to him, regardless of the sun or the shadows. The seesaw of their relationship was gone. They were now in free fall, tumbling toward a resolution that had been years in the making. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness of the common room, she could still feel the atmospheric pressure of his presence, the scent of the rain, and the taste of the salt on his lips. The surprising thing about the cupcake wasn't the beauty it had granted him, but the way it had stripped away the lies they had both told themselves. The morning would come with its cold logic and its harsh questions. The school would look at Draco Malfoy and see the same boy they had always known, sharp, pale, and guarded. But Hermione knew the truth. She knew the essence beneath the skin. And as the last ember in the fireplace died out, she made a silent promise to the dark. She would find him again, and this time there would be no potions, no masks, and no running away. The tension was peaking, the internal conflict between her heart and her history reaching a final definitive clash. The warmth was a promise, the cold was a challenge, and as the first light of dawn began to grey the windows, Hermione Granger prepared for the most important battle of her life. The battle for a boy who thought he was only beautiful when he was enchanted. The final shift was near. The air in the castle was changing, the scent of ozone and lavender replaced by the fresh, sharp smell of the coming spring. The story of the cupcake was over, but the story of Draco and Hermione was just beginning to breathe. The morning sun did not rise with a fanfare. It bled into the great hall like a slow grey apology. The heavy scent of damp stone and charred oak hung in the air, a remnant of the night storm. For the rest of Hogwarts, it was just another Thursday, a rhythmic cycle of porridge and prep. But for Hermione, every breath felt like a jarring impact against the silence of the room. She sat at the Gryffindor table, her fingers tracing the rim of her goblet with a frantic, repetitive motion. Her internal monologue was a chaotic friction of hope and terror. Without the essence of radiance, would he simply vanish back into the cold masonry of his own reputation? Then the doors swung open. The vacuum of silence that followed was different today. It wasn't the breathless awe of the previous week. It was the heavy, uncomfortable atmospheric pressure of a return to reality. Draco Malfoy walked in. He was no longer a celestial being. His hair was just blonde, missing its silken shimmer. His skin was pale and slightly sallow from lack of sleep. His eyes were a muted, stormy grey. He looked ordinary. He looked tired. He looked, to the rest of the school, like the boy who had spent the last year in the shadow of his own failures. The whispers began instantly, sharp, biting needles of sound. "The glow's gone," a Hufflepuff murmured. "Back to being a Malfoy, then," a Ravenclaw added with a smirk. Hermione's knuckles whitened as she gripped her spoon. She watched him walk toward the Slytherin table, his jaw set in a line of rigid porcelain restraint. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. The cold he projected was a physical wall, a desperate attempt to reclaim the mask he had dropped in the astronomy tower. The repulsion from his peers was visceral, a collective withdrawal now that the magical bait was gone. She couldn't stand it. The magnetic pull she felt was stronger now than it had ever been when he was glowing. It was the pull of a visceral alignment, a need to stand in the gap he had created for himself. Hermione stood up. The sound of her bench scraping against the stone floor echoed like a cannon blast. Ignoring the confused looks from Ron and Harry, she walked across the hall. Every step was a deliberate defiance of the can't-stand-it mentality. She reached the Slytherin table and stopped directly behind him. "Malfoy," she said. Her voice was steady, a clear resonance in the murmuring hall. Draco stiffened, his shoulders hunching as if he expected a blow. He slowly turned, and the look in his eyes was a jagged mixture of doubt and a plea for her to leave before he embarrassed her. "Granger, come to collect the remains of your experiment." "I came to ask if you'd like to go for a walk," she said, her gaze locked onto his. "The grounds are quite beautiful after the rain. No potions required." The silence in the great hall was absolute. The tactile friction in the air was so thick it felt like a storm was about to break inside the room. Draco stared at her, his silver ring biting into his finger as he gripped the edge of the table. He looked for the betrayal in her expression, but found only the warmth of a girl who had seen him in the dark and chosen to stay. Slowly, agonizingly, the mask broke. A small, genuine flicker of a smile, the first she had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a smirk, it was a surrender. "I suppose," he murmured, his voice dropping to that velvet resonance that made her heart perform a frantic skip. "That would be preferable to sitting here being stared at by the commoners." He stood up, and for the first time, he didn't glide. He walked beside her, his shoulder brushing hers in a deliberate approach. As they exited the hall, the whispers followed them, but they were no longer relevant. Walked in a heavy, comfortable silence. Walked in a heavy, comfortable silence toward the Black Lake, where the water was a sheet of dark glass reflecting the pale sky. The slow burn of the last few weeks was settling into a steady, glowing heat. "They think the magic is gone," Draco said, his voice quiet as they reached the shore. He looked down at his hands, which were no longer luminous. "They think the surprise is over." "They're wrong," Hermione replied, turning to face him. The atmospheric pressure between them shifted again, drawing them together in a visceral alignment. "The magic was just a catalyst, Draco. It was never the source." She reached out, her fingers lacing through his. The warmth was immediate, a grounding human electricity that made the essence of radiance seem like a cheap imitation. Draco didn't pull away. He squeezed her hand, his thumb grazing her knuckles in a gesture of absolute trust. "I don't have anything to give you, Hermione," he whispered, his eyes searching hers with a raw, unadulterated vulnerability. "No light, no glory, just a name that's hard to carry." "You have yourself," she said, her voice a low, fierce vow. "And that's all I ever wanted." The collision happened then, but it wasn't the desperate, rain-soaked clash of the tower. It was a slow, intentional meeting of two souls who had finally found their way home. Draco leaned down, his hands sliding into her hair, his fingers tangling in the curls he had once mocked. When he kissed her, it wasn't an explosion. It was a resolution. It tasted of the cold morning air and the lingering sweetness of a memory. It was a kiss of warmth after years of cold, a promise of a future where they didn't have to hide. Hermione melted into him, her hands coming up to cup his face, her fingers tracing the familiar angles of his jaw. The magnetic pull was fulfilled, the seesaw of their tension finally finding a perfect, precarious balance. They pulled apart just enough to breathe, their foreheads resting together. Draco let out a long, jagged breath, his eyes closing as he held her. "The cupcake was terrible, by the way," he whispered, a hint of his old wit returning. "Too much lavender." Hermione laughed, a bright, melodic sound that seemed to scatter the last of the mist. "It got your attention, didn't it?" "You always had my attention, Granger," he admitted, his voice a jagged rasp of truth. "The potion just gave me an excuse to let you keep it." They stood by the lake as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long, golden fingers across the water. There was no magical glow, no shimmering aura, and no choral hum. There was only a boy and a girl standing in the light of a new day, finally visible to each other. The internal conflict was gone, replaced by a profound, quiet peace. The story of the cupcake with a surprise had ended, but as they turned to walk back toward the castle, their hands still locked together, the real story was only just beginning to find its voice. The slow burn had become a constant flame, a light that didn't need a potion to stay alive. And as they stepped back into the world of Hogwarts, they did so not as enemies or experiments, but as a visceral alignment of two hearts that had found beauty in the most unexpected of places. Draco stopped one last time before they reached the stone bridge. He looked at Hermione, his grey eyes clear and bright. He leaned down and kissed her again, a quick, firm promise against her lips. "No more potions?" he asked, a playful glint in his eyes. "No more potions," she agreed, smiling. "Just us." "Good," he murmured, his hand tightening in hers. "Because I think I prefer the surprise of the reality." They walked into the castle together, the shadows retreating before them, leaving nothing but the warmth of the sun and the truth of a love that had survived the enchantment. The immediate wake of the radiance was not a void, but a heavy, echoing transition. In the days that followed the storm on the astronomy tower, the castle felt different to Hermione, sharper, more honest, and infinitely more daunting. The cold of reality had set in, and with it came the biting whispers of the student body. The spectacle was over. The angel of the dungeons had fallen back into the mundane features of a disgraced aristocrat, and the school was unforgiving in its disappointment. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, her eyes fixed on the doors of the great hall. Her internal monologue was a frantic friction of anticipation. She found herself straightening her cuffs, her fingers trembling slightly. She was no longer watching for a golden glow. She was watching for a pair of grey eyes that had promised her the truth in the dark. When Draco entered, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted, but not because of magic. It was the weight of social judgment. He walked with his head held high, though his knuckles were white as he gripped his bag. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes stark against his pale skin. He was just a boy again, and to the vultures of the great hall, that made him fair game. "Look at that!" a younger Slytherin sneered as Draco passed. The light went out. "Back to the dungeons with the rest of the snakes, Malfoy." Draco didn't flinch, but Hermione saw the way his jaw tightened, a visceral alignment of his old defenses. She didn't think. She simply acted. Pushing her plate aside, she stood up, the screech of her bench cutting through the murmurs like a hex. She didn't walk to her usual seat. Instead, she crossed the marble floor, her footsteps steady and rhythmic, and stopped right in front of Draco. The silence that followed was thick with static. "Is the seat next to you taken?" she asked, her voice clear and resonant, echoing up to the enchanted ceiling. Draco froze. His grey eyes searched hers, looking for the doubt or the betrayal he assumed was coming. "Granger," he whispered, his voice a jagged rasp. "What are you doing? You don't sit here. You'll be social suicide by dessert." "I think I can handle the fallout," she replied, a small, defiant smile touching her lips. With a deliberate approach, she sat down on the Slytherin bench. The tactile friction was immediate, the hem of her Gryffindor robes brushing against his dark trousers. The magnetic pull was different now. It wasn't the frantic draw of a potion, but the grounding, heavy warmth of a choice. Draco sat beside her, his presence a physical heat that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. For several minutes, they simply sat in a shared, defiant silence. The great hall buzzed with a new kind of energy, not worship, but shock. "You're mad," Draco murmured, though he reached under the table, his hand finding hers. His fingers laced with hers, his signet ring cold against her skin, but his palm was searingly hot. "I've been told that before," she countered, her thumb grazing his knuckles. The warmth between them was a slow burn, a steady fire that defied the judgmental stares of their peers. For the first time, they weren't the Gryffindor Golden Girl and the Slytherin Prince. They were just two people, tired of the roles they had been forced to play. Later that evening, they found themselves in the quiet sanctuary of the library. The scent of old parchment and beeswax was a familiar comfort. They were tucked away in their usual corner, the shadows of the bookshelves stretching long across the floor. "I thought you'd be disappointed," Draco said, his voice breaking the stillness. He was looking at his hands, his fingers no longer tracing silver patterns in the air. "Without the essence, I'm just this." "The essence was a mask, Draco," Hermione said, turning her chair toward him. The atmospheric pressure in the small nook shifted, becoming intimate and heavy. "It was beautiful, yes, but it was static. It didn't change when you laughed or when you were angry. This?" She reached out, her fingers grazing the sharp line of his jaw. "This is a life. This is what I want to see." The "can't help but think" was overwhelming. Draco leaned into her touch, his eyes closing. The trust was a fragile, shimmering thing between them. He reached up, his hand covering hers, pressing her palm against his cheek. "I spent so long trying to be perfect," he whispered, his voice jagged with a sudden, sharp vulnerability. "And then I spent a year trying to be invisible. I don't know how to be ordinary." "You were never ordinary," she breathed, her gaze fixed on his mouth. The collision was inevitable. Draco pulled her closer, his hand sliding to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her curls. The tactile friction was electric, a jarring impact of two souls finally finding their rhythm. The kiss was slow, deep, and utterly real. It didn't taste of lavender or magic. It tasted of tea, of mint, and of the cold Scottish wind. It was a warmth that didn't need a catalyst. Hermione felt the frantic beat of his heart against her chest, a visceral alignment that proved the surprise was never in the cupcake, but in the courage to be seen. When they pulled apart, the air between them was charged with a new kind of static. Draco looked at her, his eyes stormy and bright. For the first time, he didn't look like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "I suppose," he murmured, his thumb brushing her lower lip, "that the magnetic pull is a bit more permanent than we thought." "It's a law of physics, Draco," she teased, though her voice was thick with emotion. "And I've always been very good at science." They sat in the library as the moon rose, their hands locked together. The slow burn had finally settled into a steady flame, a light that didn't flicker when the wind blew. The conflict of the school's perception remained, but inside their small circle of candlelight, the internal monologue was finally at peace. The transition was complete. They were no longer floating in the silver dreams of a potion. They were grounded in the beautiful, messy reality of each other. The atmospheric pressure in the potion's dungeon was stifling, thick with the scent of simmering mandrake root and the sharp, metallic tang of copper cauldrons. Professor Slughorn moved between the stations with a jovial yet expectant air that made Hermione's stomach twist into a frantic knot. Today was the practical exhibition of advanced emotional catalysts, and the centerpiece of the lesson was none other than a refined version of the essence of radiance. Hermione felt the weight of the room's gaze. Since she had sat at the Slytherin table, the castle had been a pressure cooker of speculation. Beside her, Draco worked with a rigid porcelain composure, his knuckles white as he sliced shrivelfig. He was ordinary now, no glow, no hum, and the students watched him with a predatory curiosity, waiting for the golden boy to falter without his magical shimmer. "Now then," Slughorn clapped his hands, his belly shaking with a chuckle. "Miss Granger, as you've already had some, unintentional success with this brew, perhaps you and Mr. Malfoy could demonstrate the resonance of sincerity variation. It doesn't just beautify the shell, you see, it illuminates the intent." Draco froze. The internal conflict was visible in the sudden, sharp tightening of his jaw. He looked at the cauldron, then at Hermione, his grey eyes swirling with a visceral fear. To show intent was to strip away the last of his armor. "I don't think," Draco began, his voice a jagged rasp. "It's all right," Hermione whispered, her hand momentarily covering his on the table. The tactile friction was grounding, a spark of pure warmth that defied the damp chill of the dungeons. "We'll change the parameters. We won't use the moonstone. We'll use the heartstring essence." She didn't wait for his approval. With a sudden, frantic need to protect him from the class's mockery, she began to alter the recipe on the fly. She swept aside the ingredients for vanity and replaced them with sprigs of dittany and crushed rose quartz. The magnetic pull between them directed their movements. As she stirred, he added the silverweed, their hands brushing in a rhythmic, synchronized dance of shadow and light. The potion didn't turn pearlescent. It turned a deep, shimmering crimson, the color of a sunset caught in glass. "The resonance test," Slughorn announced, leaning in. "One drop on the skin. If the intent is true, the light will follow the bond." The room went silent, a vacuum of indrawn breaths. Draco looked at the crimson liquid, his throat working as he swallowed. He knew what they were all thinking, that his intent was dark, that his rot would turn the potion black. "Together," Hermione murmured. They each dipped a finger into the cooling silk of the potion and pressed them to the back of each other's hands. The collision was not an explosion, but a slow, creeping tide of heat. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a soft, amber light began to glow from the point of contact. It wasn't the blinding, artificial silver of the cupcake. It was a warm, honeyed radiance that looked like candlelight reflected in wine. The light didn't stay on their skin. It began to thread upward, weaving between them like a luminous vine, connecting Hermione's heart to Draco's. It was a visceral alignment of two souls, a resonance that bypassed the masks and the history. "My word," Slughorn breathed, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. "That's not vanity. That's a soul-binding resonance." The whispers in the dungeon died a sudden death. Pansy Parkinson's grip on her vial tightened until it cracked. Ron's mouth hung open in a confused betrayal of his own expectations. The light around Draco wasn't making him a god. gift was making him hers. It illuminated the softness in his expression, the way his eyes softened when they landed on her, and the raw, unadulterated trust he had placed in her hands. Draco looked down at the amber bridge of light, his expression fracturing into something heartbreakingly beautiful. He wasn't a masterpiece of alchemy anymore. He was a boy being loved, and the light proved it. "It's not the potion," he whispered, so low only she could hear over the bubbling of the nearby cauldrons. "I know," she replied, her eyes stinging with happy tears. The warmth in the room was overwhelming. The atmospheric pressure had shifted from judgment to awe. Draco reached out, his hand sliding into hers, and as their palms met, the amber light flared, enveloping them both in a protective, private glow. The lesson was a triumph, but the real victory was the "can't help but think" being replaced by a definitive "I know." As they cleaned their station, the static between them was no longer a sign of friction, but of a permanent magnetic bond. "You realize," Draco said as they walked out of the dungeons, his fingers still interlaced with hers, "that now everyone knows I'm hopelessly compromised by a Gryffindor. The essence of radiance doesn't lie, Draco," she teased, bumping her shoulder against his. "Neither do I," he said, stopping in the shadow of a stone archway. He pulled her into his space, the collision of their bodies a familiar, grounding heat. He kissed her then, a deep, slow resonance of his own, and for the first time the light followed them, not because of a cupcake, but because they refused to let the darkness back in. The slow burn had reached its peak. There were no more secrets, no more artificial beauties, just the two of them, resonant and true. The great hall had been transformed for the graduation ball into a cathedral of starlight and floating candles. A thin, ethereal mist clung to the floor, smelling of crushed lilies and the sharp, clean scent of the highlands after a frost. For the first time in years, the atmosphere was not one of impending war or heavy mourning, but of a frantic, joyous release. Yet, for Hermione, the air felt thin, vibrating with a familiar magnetic pull that had nothing to do with the enchantments overhead. She stood near the punch bowl, her fingers nervously smoothing the silk of her periwinkle dress. Her internal monologue was a dizzying spiral of what comes next. The castle had been a sanctuary, a laboratory where they could experiment with the friction of their souls. Beyond the oak doors lay a world of rigid bloodlines, and a ministry that still looked at Draco with a cold, unforgiving eye. "You look like you're calculating the trajectory of a falling star, Granger," a voice murmured near her ear. The resonance of his voice sent a visceral tremor through her. She turned to find Draco standing there, and the breath left her lungs. He wasn't glowing. There was no silverweed shimmer, no pearlescent sheen on his skin. He wore a suit of deep, midnight charcoal, his hair falling naturally across his forehead. He looked human. He looked tired. He looked like the boy who had sat in the dark with her and shared his fear. "I was thinking about the surprise," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the silver signet ring on his hand. "The surprise is over, Hermione," he said, stepping into her space. The tactile friction was immediate, a spark of pure warmth that defied the drafty hall. "The potion is gone. I'm just me. A bit of a disappointment for the graduation ball, wouldn't you say?" "You could never be a disappointment to me," she whispered, her fingers finding the lapel of his jacket. Draco's expression fractured, the porcelain mask of Malfoy restraint melting into a raw, unadulterated vulnerability. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming cardboard box. It wasn't velvet. It wasn't embossed with a family crest. "I made you something," he said, his voice a jagged rasp of nerves. "No magic, just a kitchen I wasn't supposed to be in, and a house elf who took pity on my lack of domestic skills." Hermione opened the box. Inside sat a single cupcake. It was slightly lopsided, the frosting a messy, pale lavender that lacked any professional luster. It didn't glow. It didn't hum. It looked entirely, wonderfully ordinary. "I realized," Draco murmured, his thumb grazing her jawline, "that the first one I ate was a theft. I wanted to give you one that was a gift. No essence of radiance. No hidden agendas. Just sugar and a very sincere attempt not to burn the castle down." Hermione felt the warmth in her chest expand until it was a physical ache. She looked up at him, her eyes stinging with happy tears. The "can't help but think" was gone, replaced by a definitive grounding. "I know." "It's perfect," she breathed. "Eat it later," he whispered, his hand sliding to the small of her back, drawing her toward the dance floor. "Right now, I believe I owe the smartest witch of her age a dance where I don't look like a luminous peacock." The collision of their bodies as they began to move was a rhythmic, synchronized grace. The music was a slow, haunting melody of violins, but Hermione only heard the steady, human thudding of Draco's heart against her own. The atmospheric pressure of the room, the stares of the professors, the whispers of the students, didn't matter. They were in a visceral alignment that had survived the death of the enchantment. As they swirled under the enchanted stars, Draco leaned down, his breath warm against her temple. "I'm not going back to the shadows, Hermione. Not if you're standing in the light." "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, her knuckles whitening as she gripped his shoulder. The slow burn had reached its final steady flame. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the end of their time at Hogwarts, Draco stopped in the center of the floor. He didn't care about the repulsion of his peers or the doubt of the world. He cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with an agonizing slowness. The kiss was the ultimate resolution. It was a collision of 2 years of suppressed friction, of "can't stand it" and "can't help but think." It wasn't the desperate act of the astronomy tower or the experimental heat of the dungeons. It was a slow, deep, and definitive kiss that tasted of the future. Pulled apart, the hall was beginning to pull apart. The hall was beginning to empty, the candles flickering low. Draco looked at her, his grey eyes bright with a light that no potion could ever replicate, the light of a man who was finally, truly seen. "So," he murmured, a small, genuine smile touching his lips as they walked toward the heavy oak doors together. What was the surprise in the cupcake anyway, aside from the vanity? Hermione leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand locked firmly in his as they stepped out into the cool night air of their new lives. "The surprise, Draco," she said, her voice a soft, final resonance in the quiet, "was that you didn't need the potion to make me fall in love with you. You just needed to be hungry enough to take a bite." They walked down the stone steps, leaving the castle behind. There was no glow, no silver mist, and no magic. Just 2 people, Ordinary and extraordinary, walking into the dawn of a world that was finally theirs to shape. The story was over, but the resonance would last forever.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story started with a silly cupcake, but it was about something much deeper. It was about masks. We all wear masks sometimes. We try to look perfect, we try to look strong. Draco used magic to be beautiful, but Hermione didn't fall for the magic. She fell for the boy hiding in the shadows. I believe real love is not about the glow. It is about what stays when the light goes out. It is about the person who holds your hand in the dark. Draco and Hermione found each other between the hate and the light. They found the truth, and that is the biggest surprise of all. I hope you enjoyed this journey. I hope it made you smile. Remember, you are enough, even without the magic. See you in the next story.